The time between Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 and then the Battle of France in June 1940 is commonly overlooked in the history of World War II, typically being referred to as the Phoney War, a period of 8 months where no major campaigns occurred between the Western Allies and Nazi Germany. But this statement isn't entirely correct. Sure, for the most part, the British and French were too busy putting their fingers in their ears and saying, la 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 la, as long as I don't look at it, the problem isn't there. But as the name would suggest, the Phoney War was still part of a real war, and some military operations were undertaken during this period. The most important of these was Operation Weserübung. I desperately hope I'm saying that right. The German invasion of Denmark and Norway on April 9th, 1940. The entire operation serves as evidence of the ineffectiveness of the British and French administrations during the early stages of the war, being unable to utilize their superior naval resources to defend the Nordic countries and diplomatically blundering the entire situation until it was too late to salvage what was left. It is also a campaign filled with many notable historical achievements, such as Germany's surprisingly effective usage of paratroopers for the first time in modern warfare. So in this video, let us explore this interesting and frequently overlooked campaign of the early stages of World War II. The Nordic campaign truly began in February 1940, with the Altmark incident off the coast of western Norway. The German tanker Altmark was transporting 299 British POWs captured by the Graf Spee back to mainland Germany, but to avoid Royal Navy patrols in the North Sea, it entered Norwegian waters. Now, under international law, this was technically allowed, however the Altmark openly denied having any POWs on board. The ship was boarded on 3 separate occasions by Norwegian Coast Guard officials, during which time the prisoners were kept in the hold of the ship, out of sight. Despite efforts by the prisoners to make their presence known to the Norwegian inspectors, the POWs were never found by any of these search parties. On February 15th, RAF aircraft spotted the ship near Egersund and signalled the nearby destroyer HMS Cossack to pursue the Altmark. The Altmark attempted to escape into a fjord, but the next day the Cossack pursued, entering Norwegian waters. The captain of the Cossack, Philip Wien, attempted to order a boarding of the German tanker, but a Norwegian Navy escort boat was dispatched to prevent this. Wien contacted the British Admiralty, who told him to negotiate with the Norwegians and carry out a joint Anglo-Norwegian inspection of the Altmark, but the Norwegian sailors present refused to participate. Regardless, Wien ordered the boarding anyway, causing the Altmark to run aground. British sailors boarded the ship, and after a brief skirmish of hand-to-hand combat, which according to some sources was the last time the Royal Navy used cutlasses in combat. Yes, cutlasses. Some bloke was fighting with a 17th century sword in 1940. That sort of reminds me of Mad Jack, if you know who that is. Following this scuffle, the British boarding party called out, "Any Englishmen here?" To which the POWs below responded, "Yes, we're all British." The liberators called out, "Well, the Navy's here," which was met with many cheers. The situation became a major propaganda piece for both the Allies and the Axis. For the British, the line, "Well, the Navy's here," became a popular saying for the rest of the war. For the Germans, this incident was seen as British attempts to force Norway into embargoing Germany, which would compromise Germany's access to aluminium and iron imports from Sweden. German propaganda claimed the Altmark incident to be proof that the British were violating international law, and were attempting to infringe Norway's independence. In Norway itself, it was a highly controversial affair that threatened to drag Norway into a war it wanted nothing to do with, as well as being an insult to Norway's state sovereignty, which had been violated by both the British and Germans. Following the Altmark incident, both the British and Germans devised plans to occupy Norway if needed. Almost immediately, on February 19th, 1940, Adolf Hitler ordered the beginning of plans for Operation Weserübung to secure the port of Narvik and the Danish Straits from British and French control. Similarly, the British created Plan R4, also known as Operation Wilfred, which involved securing Norwegian airfields, cutting off Swedish trade with Germany, and mining the Danish Straits to prevent German U-boats from leaving the Baltic Sea. The entire invasion of Denmark sounds more like a comedy sketch than a real military operation. The attack began at 4 AM on April 9th, 1940. Although the Danish government was aware that the Germans were planning some form of military intervention in Scandinavia, the Danish army was not mobilized due to fears that it would be used as an excuse by the Germans to invade. The first fighting began on Phoney Island, where the German battleship Schleswig-Holstein supported infantry landings that met little to no resistance. This was followed by the first paratroop attack ever in history at Sortström Bridge at 5 AM, conducted by 96 Fallschirmjägers. The Germans expected to encounter heavy fighting, as there was a nearby coastal fortress used by the Danish military. However, when they arrived, there were only 3 soldiers there, who promptly surrendered. The capture of this bridge allowed the German infantry landed at Funen to advance towards Copenhagen via a land route. A few hours later, the 4th Fallschirmjäger Battalion landed on the island of Allerborg, capturing a strategically important airfield that would be used as a stepping stone for the invasion of Norway. In Jutland, skirmishing between German and Danish forces began at 4:15 AM, followed by a general alarm at 4:17 that alerted all nearby Danish military forces to prepare defences. Several roadblocks were established by bicycle infantry, a type of military unit that I explored in another video. Additionally, several 20mm guns were positioned at key choke points near Bredve and Hardeslev. Sorry if I'm pronouncing those wrong. They were used effectively against German armoured cars, but ultimately failed to inflict any major damage against supporting German panzers. The roadblock defensive positions were defeated mostly by 7:15, allowing the Germans to advance past the border and further into Jutland. German warships entered Copenhagen harbour at 4:30 AM. The coast defence at Fort Middelgrund attempted to fire a warning shot at the approaching ships. However, funnily enough, most of the soldiers there were new recruits who didn't know how the guns operated, so they just didn't do anything, and they had to sit there and watch the Germans land an entire battalion of infantry nearby. The fort was captured with no resistance by the Danish garrison, and German troops began to advance on the royal palace. However, they met stiff resistance from the King's Royal Guards, who managed to repulse the initial German attack, allowing Danish reinforcements to arrive from nearby military bases. As street fighting in Copenhagen continued, King Christian X met with his ministers and Chief of the Army, General Pryor, to discuss how to react. During this time, the Luftwaffe dropped massive amounts of leaflets titled Opprop, a poor translation of proclamation, I think, which declared that if Denmark did not cease hostilities soon, the capital city would be subject to a massive bombing campaign. With seemingly no other option, since the second the Danish tried to scramble fighters, they were shot down, King Christian agreed to a ceasefire at 6 AM, which was enacted completely by 8:30. Although the majority of Danish forces agreed to lay down their arms, small parts of the army refused to give up, instead seizing a ferry and sailing to Sweden in exile, where they would form the Danish Brigade of Sweden later in the war. The entire invasion lasted little more than 6 hours, with a total combined casualty of no more than a couple dozen. Terms of the ceasefire included allowing German troops to enter and occupy the country, but the Danish civilian government would maintain control over domestic functions, and the military would remain within its designated military bases. This agreement would remain until August 1943, following a series of strikes in Denmark, causing the Germans to seize a more totalitarian control of the nation's government. Unlike Denmark, Norway managed to last a lot longer than just one day. German Kriegsmarine fleets began to travel across the North Sea on April 3rd to arrive at the designated positions. On the 9th, several marine and airborne invasions were launched in the early hours of the morning, capturing important locations such as ports and air bases. Norway's defences were quickly overwhelmed. However, one notable confrontation was the naval engagements outside Oslo. German naval forces arrived near Oslo with the aim of capturing the city and King Haakon VII to force his surrender. However, the Germans had failed to account for the defences at Oscarborg Fortress, which, although outdated, was well garrisoned and equipped with a coastal torpedo battery, which successfully destroyed the German heavy cruiser Blücher. Engagements such as this allowed the majority of Norway's government and the royal family to escape the city before it was occupied. Simultaneously, a German Kriegsmarine task force of 10 destroyers had sailed north to the port of Narvik, This port was of extreme strategic importance for the Germans, as nearly 90% of Swedish iron imports travelled through Narvik, as it was one of the few ice-free ports this far in the North Atlantic. Defending Narvik were two outdated Norwegian coastal defence cruisers, the Eidsvold and the Norge. When the German ships arrived at Narvik at 4:30 am, they initially attempted to negotiate a peaceful occupation of the harbour. However, the Norwegians refused to cooperate, as they had been ordered to defend the port from any attempted occupation. A brief battle took place, resulting in the sinking of both Norwegian ships, which resulted in 343 deaths. The Germans landed 2,000 mountaineer infantry to secure the port and surrounding area. But never fear, the Navy is here! The following day, on April 10th, the Royal Navy dispatched 5 destroyers to recapture the port. The First Naval Battle of Narvik resulted in 2 destroyers sunk on each side, as well as 6 German cargo ships. Ultimately, the Germans were blocked into the harbour and the British waited for further reinforcements to arrive before engaging again. On April 13th, battleship HMS Warspite and 9 other destroyers arrived to participate in the Second Naval Battle of Narvik. The remaining 8 German destroyers were destroyed, as well as the German submarine U-64, which was sunk on the same day by a Swordfish torpedo bomber. Despite these naval successes, the Allies failed to achieve victory at land. In the south of Norway, the Germans completely overwhelmed the Norwegian defenders by April 15th, by utilising their superior air power. In Narvik, the German mountaineers were reinforced by the surviving sailors of the sunk destroyers, as well as 1,000 Fallschirmjägers. A combined task force of British, French and Polish units landed in Narvik following the naval action to recapture the port, assisted by the 6th Norwegian Infantry Division. Although having superior numbers, and the fact that the Germans were cut off from regular supply, the British and French managed to Wallace and Gromit the situation, in the famous words of Laserpig. I'll leave a link in the top comment if you want to learn more about the key details of the battle, but what you really need to know is that by May 1940, the Norwegian campaign had become more of a hindrance to the Allies than a benefit. By this time, the Germans had launched the Benelux campaign, and began advancing into France, so there was added pressure to end the Norway campaign as soon as possible, as the forces located there were desperately needed in the defence of France. But with the majority of Norway under German occupation by this time, holding on to Narvik became an increasingly unlikely option for the Allies. Therefore, on May 24th, Operation Alphabet, the withdrawal of British, French and Polish troops from Norway, was devised in London by the British War Cabinet. In typical British fashion, they screwed over their ally Norway by not telling them about the evacuation until the very last minute on June 1st. By that time, the Norwegians couldn't protest or convince their allies to stay, so they were forced to concede defeat. By June 8th, all Allied forces in Narvik had been withdrawn, and Germany firmly held control over both Denmark and Norway. The final stage of the campaign was on June 7th with Operation Juno. 2 German battleships, the Scharnhorst and whatever this is, intercepted the British aircraft carrier HMS Glorious and her escorts while they departed from the Norwegian theatre. The aircraft carrier and escorts were sunk, causing 1,500 casualties for the British. A tragic end to a terrible campaign for the Allies. The Scandinavia campaign of 1940 was a complete mess. Beginning with the UK and Germany blatantly violating Norway's neutrality in February, followed by the 6 hours of mayhem in Denmark, and then finishing with the disappointing retreat from Narvik in June, the Allies, although able to secure a few victories here and there, failed in their main goal of defending Norway and protecting the Straits of Denmark. Both countries would remain under Axis occupation until Germany's surrender in May 1945. The Norway campaign especially stands out here. The front is commonly overlooked as a sideshow of the real battles in 1940, such as the Battle of France and Battle of Britain later in the year, but this small section of the war acted as the final nail in the coffin for the Chamberlain administration in Britain, as British political and diplomatic incompetence was blamed for the Allies' inability to defend Norway from a direct German invasion. Ultimately, this brief part of World War II is an interesting insight into the tactics that allowed for Germany's success in the early stages of the war. It also proves Britain and France's inability and unpreparedness for a war in 1939 and 1940. as a consequence of overestimating the effectiveness of appeasement in the 1930s. It proved that World War II would be a truly global war, not just fought in the fields of Europe or the deserts of Africa, but also as far north as Narvik and the Arctic Circle. And welcome to the end of the video. Can I firstly say thank you to everyone who's subscribed recently? I went from like 20 subscribers to 600 in just a week. So honestly, I know it sounds cliche, but like, I do really appreciate it. On top of that, thanks if you've made it this far through the video, and I plan on making like a whole bunch more content in the future. So stick around for that, and goodbye.